Thanks very much, Linda, and thanks to Joe for inviting me. And it's great that there's actually two sessions on Europe at this great summer school. Normally when I go to politics conferences, the session on the EU is, at the 8 a.m. session on a Sunday. So it's great to see that it's getting a bit of attention here because it's an important topic, I believe. I am going to be talking a little bit about the challenges and potential reforms, particularly democratic reforms in the EU that might be on the table. When many people talk about the challenges facing the EU, one thing that often comes up is, that we need to come up with a way to, of convincing people that European integration is a good idea. We need some way of selling Europe, which is probably kind of a trickier ask now than it was in previous years. The old mantra of peace and prosperity doesn't necessarily cut it with voters. Peace, fair enough, we do have peace among European Union member states, but that's kind of taken as a given now. It's not something that's going to have any purchase with voters. People don't think that suddenly if we were to roll back on European integration, European countries would suddenly be at war, notwithstanding what's going on in Ukraine. The prosperity pitch is probably a stronger one, but again, it's not something that has as much purchase today as it once did. People don't automatically associate the European Union with growth and prosperity. In fact, many people associate it with the opposite in the wake of the financial crisis. So what people are saying is that we need a new narrative, we need a new way to pitch the European Union to the general public. I would kind of like to move away from that way of thinking. The European Union in various guises has been with us for well over 50 years. It's older than many of its member states. How long are we going to be having this debate about, is the European Union a good thing or a bad thing? It's a reality. European integration is a reality. Our economies are deeply intertwined. Our policy-making processes, likewise. It's, I think, somewhat of a redundant and a futile debate to keep coming back to this question of whether or not the EU is a good thing. Rather than asking Europe good or bad, a more pertinent question is Europe left or right? We need to be refocusing the question on the content of EU policies. And particularly, we need to be giving voters an input into that discussion. Probably the most important or the most significant challenge that I see in the European Union from a democratic perspective is the significant and growing gap between the elite and the general public. If we don't do something to address this gap, it's likely to become the main fault line in European politics in years ahead. Not national borders, not even kind of left versus right, but the elite, the policy-making elite from across Europe against the general public. The public, who don't really feel that they have any control of the European Union, will view anything coming from Brussels with scepticism. They'll see it as coming from a Brussels dictatorship. Whereas the policy-making elite, on the other hand, the policymakers at the European level, will be viewing voters as an impediment to good governance. So voters are an obstacle that need to be negotiated in order to govern effectively. And that kind of dichotomy is summed up by the famous remarks by Jean-Claude Juncker a couple of years ago in the midst of the Eurozone crisis, when he said, "We all know what needs to be done, but we don't know how to get re-elected once we've done it." So, for him and for many other EU policymakers, voters and democracy is an impediment to good government. And there is this, yawning gap between the elite and the public on Europe. So the only way to address that is to give voters a more direct say in how Europe is governed. And if voters are given more of an input and more of a stake in these policy choices, then those existential questions about the European Union will fade into the background. Okay, I want to discuss some options for democratic reform that might see, more popular input into EU decision-making. But first, I just want to dwell a little bit longer on the nature of the democratic problem that the EU faces. One what you have is a system that is procedurally, at least, it's quite democratic. There are various different channels of democratic representation and accountability at the European level. So we elect our national governments, who are the most important decision makers in the EU. So they're directly accountable to their electorates. We also elect members of the European Parliament, who have important legislative powers in the European Union. Okay, fair enough, we don't elect the commissioners, but they're appointed by our national governments and they're accountable to the European Parliament, and the European Parliament has recently acquired greater powers of selecting the Commission President. So there are lots of different democratic channels there for the general public to have an input into the European Union. The problem is that voters are never given a choice between different visions for Europe. They're never given a choice between different policy options for Europe. In national elections, people aren't thinking about European policy when they're choosing which government, which party to vote for, so Europe doesn't play a part there. Even in European Parliament elections, the same is true. Generally, European Parliament elections in most member states are really just dress rehearsals for the next national election. They're fought over by national political parties, over national issues, and it's, different visions of Europe aren't put before the voters. It's very difficult to discern any real message coming out of European Parliament elections that are essentially 28 separate different elections that just happen to take place at the same time. Now, all of this has meant that there has been growing distrust of EU institutions as the European Union has begun to take a more, let's say, significant role in economic management. I have a slide here. The first graph I want to show you there is just trust in the European Parliament over the last 10 years, recorded in Eurobarometer surveys, which take place twice yearly. So, over the duration of the financial crisis, and even before then, there's been quite a significant pattern of decline in trust for the European Parliament. And the same is true for other EU institutions. And you're all aware of this, and it culminated in the recent European Parliament elections with significant gains for Eurosceptic parties, for nationalist parties, parties who are essentially against the European Union. So, what many people have advocated, particularly in the wake of the last European Parliament elections, is that we should now roll back on political integration, return power to domestic political institutions, our national parliaments, our national governments, as only there is there any real political legitimacy and real political accountability. That's a point that you'll hear being made quite a lot, and I believe the UK ambassador to Ireland was here at the beginning of the week and he made a point along those lines. And many commentators in recent weeks have argued even for a return to a system whereby the European Parliament is no longer directly elected, but rather is just made up of national parliamentarians who go to Brussels every month to vote on EU legislation. That way, it's argued, there will be greater accountability and we would do away with the farcical European Parliament elections. I would take a very different view. Returning power to national political institutions makes sense if that is indeed the only place where there is political legitimacy and political trust. The problem is that there are serious problems of political trust in national political institutions also. In the second, slide here, we have the same respondents across Europe, across 25 EU member states, asked about whether or not they trust their national parliament. There has been also a pattern of decline in this over the last 10 years, and actually from a much lower starting point. So there is, as you've heard in earlier sessions this week, genuine problems about democratic legitimacy at the national level. National parliaments, governments, and particularly political parties have been abandoned by voters. There's very little trust in them. So returning power to national institutions is not necessarily the way to solve the underlying problem. So in direct opposition to and contrast to what Eurosceptics would argue, I actually think that the European Union has the potential to solve some of these democratic legitimacy problems that we're seeing domestically. And the reason for that is that a lot of the problems at the domestic level come from, let's say, the convergence of the political space, if you like. Political parties no longer offering genuine alternatives to the voters. Mainstream parties in every European country are accused of being too alike, not offering any real alternatives. And part of the reason for that is economic globalization. Okay, countries aren't in control of their own economic destiny to the same extent as they were in previous generations. They're at the mercy of international developments. And so there aren't as many genuine alternatives for any given country in a globalized economy. Now, the reason why the European Union might be a solution to this is that a bloc of 500 million people, the largest economy in the world, has the potential to be much more in control of its own destiny than any individual country. So there are genuine policy alternatives that the European Union can make that simply aren't feasible for a national government. And if those policy alternatives were given to the voters, that would be a way of reinstituting democracy that we have seen eroded over recent years. So this kind of situation was summarised by political scientist Vivian Schmidt, who said that at the EU we have policy without politics, whereas at the national level we have politics without policy. So in the EU, what she's saying there is, in the EU, important policy decisions are made, but there's no political contest over those decisions, and voters aren't given a chance to have a say over those issues. At the national level, there is genuine political contest, but the policy content of that is very, very weak. So I would argue that instituting genuine democratic institutions at the European level offers an opportunity to reclaim some of the control that voters have lost over their own destiny. And if we think about sovereignty as, in the practical sense of an ability to shape your own destiny, then I think that European integration can actually enhance our sovereignty rather than the opposite. So, I'm not sure how much time I have there, but so I just wanted to talk briefly about some options for reform that might lead to a situation whereby voters are given these policy alternatives at the European level and are given some ownership over EU decision-making. The obvious place to start would be with European Parliament elections. Now, like I said, the European Parliament elections are fairly pointless. Apologies to Matt, who's just got elected in the last European Parliament elections. But, what did they really tell us? Like I said, they're dress rehearsals for the next national elections. They don't send any clear message on what Europeans want, because there's different elections in every country over different issues. They don't even offer a way to have genuine accountability for individual MEPs, because nobody really knows what they do in Brussels and Strasbourg. So we can be bold when we think about reform for the European Parliament, because we're not going to lose anything, essentially. One reform was instituted at the most recent election, which was to link the outcome of the European Parliament elections to the selection of the Commission President. Now, that's a positive development in my eyes. It injects a bit more politics into European Parliament elections, but it's a painfully indirect way of doing it. So what we were saying in the last elections was, OK, you vote for a national party. That national party will sit with a group in the European Parliament. That group in the European Parliament will vote for a candidate as Commission President. There's several steps removed there from voter to the actual selection of the Commission President. And not surprisingly, voters didn't engage with that. It wasn't covered with any great degree of interest by national media in most countries. It didn't work. Much more direct would be to change what appears on the ballot paper. So instead of, if we could just go to the next slide. What we have, as you know, on ballot papers in European elections at present is a list of national candidates, national parties, who are really competing over national issues. What if, instead of this, we were presented with a list of European party groups? If you could just press, if you don't mind, please, the next. Thank you. So here we have just mocked it up, just a list of the transnational political groups that are the main actors, the main decision-making blocks in the European Parliament anyway. The problem is that they're not presented to the voters at election time. What if these were presented to us on our ballot paper instead of national parties? And in every country, these were presented to voters. These party groups produce manifestos, but nobody gets to see them. and they do present real alternatives. I was looking at the manifestos that these party groups presented ahead of the last election. There were real differences between the parties on issues like austerity versus stimulus, on legacy debt, on trade relations with the US, on relations with Russia. These are issues that voters should have control over, but they weren't given that choice. In the last European Parliament, an MEP from the UK, Andrew Duff, proposed something along these lines. What he suggested was that there should be an additional 25 MEPs who are elected in one pan-European constituency along these lines, with just these party groups presented to voters. And in that way, everybody would be voting for the same transnational party groups, and they would be looking at the issues that those party groups were putting before the electorate. Now, unfortunately, Andrew Duff lost his seat to UKIP, so it remains to be seen whether anybody else is going to pick up that baton in the next... Well, the thing is, his constituents wouldn't have had a clue that he was proposing this. That's the nature of the European Parliament. But it's a good suggestion, I think. And we could go even further, and we could abandon national constituencies altogether. Why not just have one pan-European constituency for all MEPs? We vote for different party lists. The party lists are given seats in proportion to their vote share. It would refocus European Parliament elections on the genuine policy choices, the policy alternatives that Europe faces. Now, the main objection, of course, to that is, well, how do you guarantee national balance in the seats that are filled? Well, I would say, who cares, really? National interests are already very, very well represented in the EU. We have the Council of Ministers, we have the European Council, there's one commissioner per member state. Do we really need to replicate national divisions in the European Parliament as well? Would it not be better to make the European Parliament election something different, to be a forum where citizens are given a choice about different visions of Europe, and that choice is then represented in the European Parliament and will feed into the policy-making process? Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.